Hello, everyone. My name is Shelley McCoy, and on behalf of the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. The series today and all our webinar series are really made part thanks to the contribution of the Government of Canada. For today's webinar, we're very pleased to be hosting Dr. Shelley Denny. Shelley is a Mi'kmaq from FCAS-FCSA First Nation and the Director of Aquatic Research and Stewardship at the UINR Institute of Natural Resources. She attended the Acadia University, where she obtained her Bachelor in Science in Biology, and later obtained her Master in Science in Biology at St. FX University and PhD at Dalhousie University. Her research interests are in exploring ways Indigenous and Western knowledge can be used for the benefit of all, known as two-eyed seeing. Her doctoral research built on her current interests and experience at UINR by exploring how Aboriginal and treaty fisheries can be governed in Nova Scotia using two-eyed seeing. As the founder of Indigenous Minds Consulting, Dr. Denny Otter's interests are to assist government, academia, and industry understand differences between knowledge systems and how they can be harnessed to enhance resource management in Canada. Today, she will be speaking on concept of salmon conservation and management from Mi'kmaq perspective and collaborating for effective salmon governance. After the session, we're going to be doing question and answers, and maybe even partway through, I'll let Shelley be able to inform everybody on that. But for right now, I would like to welcome Shelley and turn the webinar over to her for her presentation. So Shelley.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. We've been practicing how to share the screen, and I hope this works well, or works at least.
You're good to go. It looks good.
All right, excellent. The only problem is I see my face everywhere. There we go. I'll just move that over, move this down. All right, should be getting ready to go. So again, thank you very much. I will be breaking up this webinar into two different sections. Sometimes 30 minutes of discussion of information is quite overwhelming. So I thought we'd break it up into the landscape that underpins Mi'kmaq and federal relations, specifically the historical, legal, and political landscape, and then leave time for some discussion and questions, and then move into two-eyed seeing and how we can apply that to Atlantic salmon or bloodmoon, followed by more discussion and questions. So I am Mi'kmaq, and the Mi'kmaq have been around here for a long time. We are one of the Indigenous peoples of Eastern Canada and Northern Maine. We're part of a larger confederacy known as the Wabanaki Confederacy, or People of the Dawn. We are part of this confederacy with the Wet'suwet'en, the Beskim-Kwade, and the Penobscot. As a culture, our language became distinct from our neighboring nations quite a while ago. We've been known to be semi-nomadic, and we move with the animals historically, but largely our diet was derived from aquatic species. Before contact and before settlement, the Mi'kmaq were a self-governing and organized society. The traditional governing body, the Santee Maui is also referred to as the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, were the ones overseeing the districts. There are three levels, the national, district, and local levels. We do have a head of the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Grand Chief, with their executive, the G-Captain, and the Badus. And the Badus is more of the knowledge holder and helps make decisions based on those knowledge, on the historical knowledge. There are 7 districts in Mi'kmaq, and our districts were occupied by families. District chiefs also met with the Grand Council to discuss what will be harvested and where. And our Santee Maui, our Mi'kmaq Grand Council, is still in existence today, but does have a limited role due to imposed legislation. So the Indian Act, as it was imposed on Indigenous peoples, essentially created a new form of governance that wasn't the traditional form. But we've had a lot of time and a lot of years interacting with Europeans, and they began settling in Mi'kmaq in the 1600s. As a result of the settlements, there were a series of treaties established between the English, the British, and the Wabanaki Confederacy. Some of them that are very important is the Treaty of 1726, which ended conflict between the British colonies and the Wabanaki Confederacy, which was renewed later in 1749 and 1752. However, Britain and the Mi'kmaq were at war between 1755 and 1758, and the Mi'kmaq continued to remain allies of the French. But the treaties weren't necessarily about ceding land, as these are pre-Confederation treaties. They predate Canada. So they're more about the renewal of peace, especially the Treaty of 1760-61, and it created a new political order for coexistence. It was also an attempt at formalizing a trading relationship and to govern those relations to end war and secure trade. In this Treaty of 1752, for example, the Mi'kmaq would continue to hunt and fish as usual and trade at truck houses. Originally, the Mi'kmaq Grand Council were signatories to those treaties. Regarding some of the legal underpinning for rights, I thought maybe a good idea to distinguish between treaty rights and Aboriginal rights. But all rights, whether they're Aboriginal or treaty, are legal entitlements. And Aboriginal rights are those based on original occupancy. So as Indigenous peoples, we were here and the original inhabitants of our land. They're also referred to sometimes as the inherent rights. And treaty rights are negotiated between groups. We see this in modern day land claims agreements, and they're mostly about exchanges. In Canada, it varies. In the East, we have pre-Confederation treaties. In the West, we start after Canada became a country. We do see treaties that are there to give up land and to divide rights amongst different nations. But regardless whether it's an Aboriginal right or a treaty right, both are protected under the Constitution Act under Section 35. Section 35 and Section 52 do create some challenges for governance and management, especially with fisheries management. Aboriginal treaty rights create what's known as legal pluralism within Canada. And because these rights are protected in the Constitution Act, it elevates those rights over current legislation if found to be inconsistent. So in other words, if there is inconsistency between what's in regulations or legislation between the practices of Aboriginal people, the practices of Aboriginal people supersede. But legal pluralism does play an important role as the empowerment of a dual legal system and mutual rights for self-determination. And this creates challenges for abiding by Canadian law, yet empowers the Mi'kmaq with the ability to make law. So Mi'kmaq do have both Aboriginal and treaty rights. And Aboriginal rights are not just about the use of fish for food, social, and ceremonial needs. It's about the right for self-determination, the use of traditional lands, etc. And we do have a case in Nova Scotia, actually a case here outside my community, Denny, Paul, and Sillaboy, who were charged for fishing salmon in an estuary in Humsey Brook or Indian Brook in our community. And the Aboriginal right was recognized within that court case as well. But most people hear of the Sparrow decision, and that was the Musqueam in British Columbia who have the same set of rights. But it is applied by Department of Fisheries and Oceans as a matter of policy. So even though we do have Denny, Paul, and Sillaboy, we still refer to some of the things as Sparrow for clarification, I guess. So the treaty rights, we do have those as well. And in 1985, there was the recognition that our treaties are still valid and in force today. And pre-Confederation treaties, as I mentioned previously, did not extinguish Mi'kmaq sovereignty. And most people are familiar with the treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood that was demonstrated in the case of Marshall 1 and 2 back in 1999. Case law is pretty important for Indigenous peoples and for Mi'kmaq people here in Atlantic Canada. Aboriginal rights have priority of access over user groups. So we do have priority of access over sport and commercial fisheries, but that doesn't mean it's exclusivity. Provincial law, federal official regulation, legislation, and ministerial discretionary authority infringe Mi'kmaq or Aboriginal and treaty rights. We've seen this in numerous Fishery Act violations. We've seen this in license requirement, discretionary authority for granting or refusing to accommodate rights without outlining criteria, and lack of sensitivity to the rights of Aboriginal people are direct infringements. However, there are limits to governance. We do know that Aboriginal treaty rights and title are not absolute. Conservation of personal safety and the safety of others, for example. Non-Aboriginal economic, regional fairness, and historic dependence on the resource or other justifiable objectives. We have mining, agricultural, forestry, hydroelectric power, etc. And the Mi'kmaq treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood. Treaty rights are subjected to regulation, but without justification, economic restrictions to acquiring necessities, and limited exercise of treaty rights to the area traditionally used by the community. And this has caused a lot of confusion because as a result of the Indian Act, many Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from their areas, historical areas of residency. But you can't debate the use of historical Mi'kmaq districts as not being historical itself. So it's very important that we recognize that the Mi'kmaq did have their concepts of historical jurisdiction, I guess I would say it. So that's very important. But at the same time, Aboriginal treaty rights limit federal and provincial jurisdiction. And that means that they have to take into consideration the Aboriginal rights and don't have full decision-making authority to make those decisions. Other important cases are the duty to consult. So the duty of the Crown must consult with First Nations, and especially for those things that may impact Aboriginal rights and title and treaty rights and title. But there is that consultation, and consultation is a form of tokenism, but it is a commitment to engage in a meaningful process. It doesn't necessarily imply an agreement, but must include accommodation and depends on the seriousness of the potential impact to the rights or title. But also too, First Nations must have a process for themselves to be engaged. And of course, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is now supported by Canada. The UNDRIP Act was signed June 21st, 2021, to support the rights of Indigenous people here in Canada. So over the next year or so, they'll be developing an action plan to figure out how they're going to go and address this. But I think it's very important that we can start to consider about some of those things that are in UNDRIP. And there's quite a few articles, 46, and I've only named a few here. But if you do have a chance, I do suggest that people to look up those articles and see what it's about. And one of the things that I do like is participation in decision-making in matters affecting their rights. So there is an article in there that does support the necessity for Indigenous peoples to be involved in governance and in fisheries management. All right, that ends my legal components. So moving on to the political landscape. As I mentioned before, we were a self-governing society prior to settlement and colonization. So now there are 13 autonomous communities that derive their authority from the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was one of those pieces of legislation that is assimilating, I guess, assimilation policies, created the reserve system, created the notions of status and who are Indians and who aren't. But in 2008, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia organized themselves to another political body referred to as the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs. And their role was to work together to develop Mi'kmaq governance structure that unites and empowers the Mi'kmaq. Not all First Nations communities are part of the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs, but most of them are. And also too, we still have the Mi'kmaq Grand Council still in existence in Mi'kma'ki. So some of the things that the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs were able to develop to support governance was to work with the province and Canada to develop an umbrella agreement. And basically, this was done in 2002 to say that, yes, we will work together and we are politically committing to each other to do that. Later on in 2007, they developed a framework agreement that promoted those negotiations towards the resolution of issues respecting Mi'kmaq rights and title. But under this framework agreement, it provided that process for consultation known as the terms of reference. And those terms of reference are there specifically to address those issues of immediate concern, like, for example, salmon management, salmon governance. It lays out those principles and rules for consultation. It does not commit parties to come to an agreement, but it is on record and with prejudice. So that means that it is something that can be used in the court of law for or against the Mi'kmaq people. All right, that was the first half. I can't see anybody. Are there any questions so far?
And for questions, just to let you know how to go about it, if you wanted to voice your own question, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. And if you want to type in your question, I will happily read it out loud for Shelley to answer.
Quite bunch today. I often get questions about like what are First Nations and versus the nation. What's a nation to nation relationship look like? Some of those questions. No questions yet?
Not yet.
Really quiet bunch. Okay, well, I'll keep going. That's okay.
Yep, you go ahead, Shelley. And they might think of something by the end and come back to it, so.
Okay, two-eyed seeing is a concept coined by Elder Albert Marshall here in Eskasoni. And he talks it talks about this a big philosophical thinking that wouldn't it be great if we could just come together and value the strengths of our knowledge systems and use that for the benefit of all. And some of the things that I've struggled with in the past regarding two-eyed seeing is that concept of, what is, what would be the benefits of all, and how can we come together and identify what we feel are the best components to our knowledge system. But learning about knowledge as a knowledge systems has really enabled me to put that into context and apply it in my work. So I see two-eyed seeing as an integration of knowledge systems. And I always like to emphasize that everybody comes with a knowledge system, whether you're community, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. It can be a scientific knowledge system or institutional knowledge system, but ultimately it's about knowledge itself, how we transmit, practice, and adapt knowledge. But ultimately it's those values and beliefs that underpin the knowledge system that are often ignored. And these are often expressed as ethics or morals that guide what we do and why. But it can be a barrier to collaboration, but also that opportunity for two-eyed seeing. And it's very important also to know what is Western knowledge versus Indigenous knowledge, and that's fundamental to two-eyed seeing. And Western knowledge is referred to the science-based knowledge that attempts to produce empirical information that can be repeatedly generated. Systematic verification process to test questions from observations, designed to reduce bias, and it's also known as the scientific method. So whether you're in social science or natural science, there is the hypotheses development, design, execution, analysis, and interpretation. It's considered to be fully objective and indisputable. It's most often transmitted in written form. And when we see this applied in fisheries, it is a segregation, a hierarchy in science and management. So Western knowledge system does have values. When we're talking about transmission, the values are regarding peer-reviewed publications or conference presentations, posters. When we practice the Western knowledge system, it's often about quantitative assessments or qualitative assessments, emphasis on the use of the scientific literature. How do we adapt to new knowledge? Well, we have to find new knowledge to override the existing knowledge using the scientific method. And the belief is that there's only one true way of knowing, and this is often seen as post-positivism theory in natural sciences, but social sciences value multiple theories. Indigenous knowledge, on the other hand, is a bit broader than Western knowledge. Ultimately, there is a lack of shared understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems, and there have been 4 different orientations described by a colleague of mine, Nicole Tulip. And most of us think about the ecological as the primary components of Indigenous knowledge systems, and I do agree, yes, there is that part. We do know, as Indigenous peoples, a lot about the relationship of ecology, of fish in different habitats, and timing of migrations, and things like that. But there's also some of the other orientations. One is the critical, where there's power placed over Indigenous knowledge systems, so you never quite consider it to be equal. Collaborative is where we hope to be with two-eyed seeing, but Indigenous knowledge people will describe the knowledge system more so as relational than the other components. And when we're talking about the relational knowledge, Indigenous knowledge It is a system of knowledge where Indigenous knowledge is the relationship with the natural world. It's not about the relationship, it is a relationship. So some of those strengths are that it reflects a distinct way of knowing. It's often highlighted as different from Western science. It's cyclical and dynamic, so it's never static. It includes appropriate codes of conducts and systems of governance, and it's broader than the what, it's also the how. So when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, it's not what we know, it's how we know what we know, which is often underpinned by those values and belief systems. It's not something that we can think as universal. It does require our scientists and resource managers to think about another way of knowing and to recognize it as its own. But it also requires empowerment at multiple levels. So it's not something that can just happen at the science level or the resource management. It has to be throughout the processes. So the Mi'kmaq knowledge system values are often described as different, as I mentioned. So there's about oral and storytelling as primary uses of transmission. We're talking about the practice. It's about survival and experience. And a lot of the time we describe Nediglim, which is a Mi'kmaq value, but it describes a way that people govern themselves. It's about sustainability through self-imposed limitations, preventing waste, sharing, and giving back through ceremony. So when we're looking for new knowledge, how do we adapt? New practices are based on experience, whether it's individual or collective. And a fundamental belief of the Mi'kmaq knowledge system is Imsit Nogama, which means all my relations. But it is about the relationship between the living and the non-living. And this includes spirituality. Sorry, that's my dog. That one got back in there. So we're thinking about two-eyed seeing. I've developed a theoretical framework for two-eyed seeing. So taking into consideration the power relations between the knowledge systems, and also understanding that there are differences. So when we're talking about two-eyed seeing, it's like using those strengths of knowledge systems for the benefit of all. And we talk about strengths, we're really talking about those values. So tensions lead to understanding the differences, and shared values and beliefs can bridge knowledge systems together. But ultimately, we need to think about social justice. And social justice as a theory is valued both by Western and Indigenous knowledge systems itself. And social justice is about that fair treatment, including the respect for the rights of minorities or those oppressed in society that results in transformative action. So we need to see some sort of positive outcome arising from our interactions. There needs to be some sort of relevancy and a way forward. So in the theoretical framework, we do talk about that contested space as a process-based co-learning, respecting for values. And when we start to integrate our knowledge systems, it comes down to respecting beliefs and then negotiating values, understanding what's important to both sides, to both knowledge systems, and then integrating those for an enhanced understanding or solution or transformative action. So we're getting to the Atlantic salmon fishery, or Blamoeg. It's a pretty important species to the Mi'kmaq. It's often described as one of those iconic species. Not very many salmon out anymore, so we often save it for special occasions. It's one of those fish that can feed a lot of people. Salmon are quite large, and it does go around. But it's also valued by the non-Mi'kmaq and does support rural communities. So salmon, of course, has been in decline for some time now. There's no longer a commercial fishery. 22, 21, and 20, the law of salmon fishing areas are no longer fished recreationally or by First Nations. Most of the allocations held through agreements with Department of Fisheries and Oceans occur in SFA 18, which is the Gulf side, and SFA 19, Eastern Cape Breton. Some communities do enter agreements with DFO, and some communities do not. And those that do not are often license conditions are imposed on that community as a matter of policy from DFO. So there was conflict in the salmon fishery, so that is that contested space. We were also dissatisfied with the lack of salmon consultation on the recreational retention fishery. Back in 2012, I think we're coming up to 10 years now, First Nations were limited in the number of tags to only select rivers, whereas recreational fishery could target all rivers in SFA 18. There was there's absolutely no opportunity to negotiate. License conditions were often imposed if there couldn't be resolution or to some of the if communities couldn't come into agreement with DFO or vice versa on what they like to see in their license conditions. And the recreational fishery had input through their advisory processes with DFO. And Mi'kmaq people in general were feeling that they were bearing the burden of conservation measures when the Western law supports Mi'kmaq rights. So in 2012, the salmon consultation table was initiated. So it took a while for DFO to respond to a request for consultation, but they did. And it's quite a large table. There are Department of Fisheries Ocean representatives from policy, resource management, and science, and the regional director generals from 2 regions, so it's not just one. There are provincial representatives and Parks Canada, as Parks Canada has jurisdiction for their rivers and it's not covered by DFO, but there's also Mi'kmaq representation. It's co-chaired by the Mi'kmaq chief for the fisheries portfolio and the regional director generals. The meeting happens 2 times per year, and we are in our 10th year of operation. And I believe we're coming up to a consultation meeting in the next week or so. So again, resolving that contested space. Consultation, because it wasn't getting anywhere, and there was a lot of discussion, but not a lot of understanding. It led to the creation of working groups to resolve issues. And these working groups were off the record and without prejudice. So that meant we could talk freely and not have to worry about the things that we said and whether they were going to be recorded and taken and used in court. So it became a learning forum for us to understand the management process that DFO was involved in and the province and parks, but also as an opportunity to learn from the Mi'kmaq in terms of our perspectives for managing salmon and how Mi'kmaq govern themselves under Medigling. So it's also that opportunity to build trust, and importantly, the use of two-eyed seeing was something that we both valued, and the need was there to really try to understand each other's perspective. I was fortunate to be attending a course at Dalhousie at the time, and it was community-based co-management. And I struggled whether or not the process that we were in as consultation was co-management. I did learn that it wasn't co-management, but at the same time, I was able to distinguish the different perspectives that we have for managing and conserving and governance of salmon. So the Western perspective for DFO and the provincial perspective, even Parks Canada, was much different from the Mi'kmaq perspective in terms of, the worldview underpinning our knowledge system was quite different. I mean, there was very much the Western command and control, scientific reductionist-based approach that the Western perspective valued, and of course the application of a single rule to multiple watersheds. Whereas the Mi'kmaq valued multiple ways of knowing, and our knowledge is holistic and varies depending on place. The management philosophy, there is policy to support conservation and sustainable use and benefits. And our philosophy is about Medigling. It's about sustainability, limiting oneself, not wasting. It's essentially Mi'kmaq law. Who benefits? Again, those are policy developed or derived beneficiaries, but it's not just salmon for Mi'kmaq, it's there for Canada and common property. Mi'kmaq, on the other hand, think that there is a reciprocal relationship between salmon and Mi'kmaq, and that salmon is there for not just people, but for animals as well, and it's communal, so it can't be owned by a single person. When it comes to the management, there's differences between structure and access for sure. We see a lot of the regulations rooted in policy. We see different structures for science and management. A lot of the time, conservation is about limiting the removal of salmon, and it's also prescriptive. If the fish counts or the conservation aid requirement has not been met, then these are the actions that follow. The Mi'kmaq, on the other hand, a lot of the time it's about oral knowledge reflected in fishing practices and rooted with those interactions and with the natural world, based a lot upon Mi'kmaq responsibility through that reciprocal relationship. And it's not just about the fisher. The fisher is also the scientist and the naturalist and the manager. We have more of a holistic view of conservation, and it is preventative. So we we would prefer to not be at the point where we have to count every fish, but unfortunately that is our reality today. Access, salmon access is a privilege, and it's granted through the license regime, whereas the Mi'kmaq have constitutionally protected rights. Some of those rights are negotiated in terms of access through the agreements with the federal government. And it's also collective, so it doesn't belong to just one Mi'kmaq, or it belongs to all of Mi'kmaq people. Regarding the, I believe it was the specific management, yes. So different areas are closed and open based on their conservation aid requirements. We see that some areas are open for everyone and not so much for others. Throughout our participation, we've been able to reduce the, I guess not us, but the influence reduction per license from 8 grills to 0 over 7 years. They still do issue approximately 2,500 licenses. It has gone down since you cannot retain, but for the most part, the fishers are there to do the catch and release. And they do have their areas that they tend to preserve, such as the certain areas that they believe were spawning habits. And the Mi'kmaq perspective, of course, is we feel like we've been restricted. We can't go everywhere that the recreational fishers visit and harvest. There is that understanding that you take what you get. So having access to only grills or the smaller salmon is something that goes against Mi'kmaq values and beliefs. And that salmon is meant to be shared. It's not something that you take for yourself. And it's often the protocol is that the first salmon you get must be shared or given to someone else. But a lot of time, and we're finding that, it's really about the law. The law between the perspectives is what causes a lot of the conflict, and the lack of understanding of why the law is there creates some of those issues. So some of the retention rules that the Western perspective has is that it takes place, the fishery takes place on a surplus population. Catch and release occurs in rivers with populations of salmon that are greater than 25% of its conservation aid requirement. And often management is based on the previous year's assessment. So you don't always have in a real-time idea of what's going on with salmon. Mi'kmaq perspective is that your fishing strategy is determined at the time of fishing. If you don't see fish, you're not going to take fish. And if you only see a few fish, then you can't take many. So it's based on that knowledge that's gathered in real time, and it's more adaptive as opposed to prescriptive. Conservation measures, again, those regulations, what you can take and what you can't, and their understanding is that if you keep large salmon for spawning, then there's more eggs to be contributed to the population. Whereas the Mi'kmaq people, retention is nedigalimk, so you make those decisions based on your understanding of nedigalimk and sharing and taking what you need. We fish for balance. So while one population or one perspective may be preserving the large, Mi'kmaq people will retain those large fish because it's a large fish. It can feed more people, and you don't have to take as many fish to get the same amount of food. And one of the other striking things that we found was the catch and release strategy. Catch and release fishers believe that their fishing strategy minimizes, eliminates retention, but still contributes to mortality. And Mi'kmaq perspectives were that, we were taught to not play with your food. If you don't need salmon, then you don't go and fish for salmon. So generally thinking that it's very harmful and disrespectful, and as a conservation strategy, you still contribute to mortality. But overall, the conservation harvest plan was developed through the consultation table and the working group. And it was process-based, so I think without the working group, we would have really struggled for a very long time. It does respect Mi'kmaq rights and respects the declining status of Atlantic salmon, but it also values both knowledge systems, both the Mi'kmaq and DFO knowledge systems. And in the end, there was an agreement to accept the DFO determination of status, to use one conservation measure, which is an allocation, and incorporate Mi'kmaq values of fishing, especially methods and no limits or seasons, and the concepts of sharing one's catch. Other things that happened that were quite positive from the whole experience was that we did improve fisheries governance on multiple levels. We improved technical capacity through collaboration, so we were sharing human resources and also sharing data used in assessments. Previous to the consultation table, there was a mismatch between the timing of reporting and the timing of the reporting and the expectation that reporting would be weekly. So the data that they used in assessments was that mismatch, then weren't quite getting the data when they needed to. We've improved the current management of the recreational fisheries, so we're able to participate in the warm water closures, policies, and reduction in tags. On the Mi'kmaq side, we have improved reporting of Mi'kmaq salmon harvest for assessments. We work together better with our communities for the timely receipt of that information. This is new, and we're co-evolving governance to address current gaps. We did notice on our side it was more about the organizations that were involved and less so about the fishers. So we developed an advisory process to feed into the consultation process, and also developed external communication to keep our fishers informed. So we now have a Facebook group where they can access information on status. And also too, we're able to balance Mi'kmaq cultural expression with conservation. Agree to that primary conservation measure and coexist. Respect each other's values and beliefs, and do your best to help each other out. So some of the things that I'll leave you with, because I think I've gone a little bit longer than I thought I would. Case law and political commitments do create that legal platform for interactions between Indigenous peoples and the state or the federal governments that's further refined with established tribal processes for consultation. So, yes, there's case law, but if you don't have the intent to, take responsibility and create those processes, it does not get anywhere. And right now, it is our only current governance mechanism for Mi'kmaq participation in salmon governance, although we are developing and taking the lead on developing our relationships with the recreational fisheries associations in Nova Scotia. And ultimately, consultation is an effective process to create the opportunity to learn from each other, to address conflict, to build relations, improve cultural awareness, and fisheries governance. So I see more as consultation as one of those two-eyed-seeing interaction forums where we all need to learn about each other's knowledge systems in order to move forward together. And Balalio, thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. That's a great presentation. We're going to open it to questions once more. We actually have two questions that had come in regarding the first part of your presentation, and there's a question regarding your second. So I'll start with the first two that we had previously. So the question is, when Canada signed UNDRIP, did anything meaningful change?
Did anything meaningful change? Yes, political will, I think, was the biggest change. So the ability, or the willingness at least, of Canada to think about this and to think about how they can incorporate those articles of UNDRIP. So they had, at the time, they had 2 years to make an action plan. So that will be developed, I guess, next year. So I'm very interested to see their action plan and what the next steps are. But I think political will is amazing for that right now, because UNDRIP has been around since 2007, and Canada had not signed it then. In 2016, had not signed it. In 17, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, signing to develop an act for this is quite significant.
Perfect. The second question is the duty to consult only triggered when it had potential impact on fishing rights, or does it get triggered for any approach used by the Crown? And that is followed up with that could indirectly have an impact on fishing rights, for example, using the single species precautionary approach.
So consultation, the process itself is developed for Nova Scotia. So it's not necessarily a federal process. But what DFO had done was to adopt in the interim that process. So the consultation being triggered would be more so for provincial natural resource development, like wind farms that has potential to impact hunting and fishing, hunting rights, habitat changes, well, oil and gas even. So that would be a trigger for consultation. So even oil and gas in Newfoundland is a trigger for consultation in Nova Scotia. So through the Impact Assessment Agency. So there's different venues, different avenues, different federal organizations that that consultation can be triggered through. I hope that answered your question. It's largely been the Impact Assessment Agency that has been working with the legal team here in Nova Scotia and the Assembly Mi'kmaq Chiefs to initiate those processes and to establish consultation. And there are long processes.
Okay. The next one's a language issue. Do Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq still speak their native language? If so, what is the importance of this language in knowledge transmission?
Yes, there are Mi'kmaq who still speak the language. It depends where you're located. We are losing our language at a very quick rate, even despite the immersion programs that we have, which is concerning. Most of our elders do speak Mi'kmaq. The Cape Breton communities tend to have a higher proportion of Mi'kmaq speaking members as opposed to the mainland, but there are, an active attempt to maintain that language, and it is very important for, knowledge transmission for many reasons. The worldview is transmitted through the language. So in the Mi'kmaq language, for example, you'll see it's never I person, or the people are never first. They're always kind of like part of the action. So Mi'kmaq language is action based. So if something were to impact me, I would be at the end of that word. So even to name myself, like I would say my name, or I am named Shelley, and then in Mi'kmaq would be Deluisi, which is the Shelley. So it's a one word that has that the person in it. What I find very interesting about the Mi'kmaq language is that it's gender neutral. We don't have she and her and him. Like it's just them, like they, them. So I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I think that's very important because the worldview is transmitted through the language. And it's unfortunate that we are losing our speakers.
The next question is regarding the two-eyed approach. Is the two-eyed approach for salmon management applied somewhere else in Canada?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of work going on using two-eyed seeing, but two-eyed seeing is a Mi'kmaq concept, right? So it is our understanding of how we as Mi'kmaq people integrate our knowledge system with the Western knowledge system. Other nations have used concepts such as the wampum belt. The Maori have used their concepts of bridging. So I think all Indigenous peoples have their own understanding of how this happens. But if you look through the literature, if you do a Google search, you'll actually be quite surprised at the application of two-eyed seeing. It's in health, it's in natural resources, it's in governance. Well, I see it very important for governance. It's everywhere. There's a lot of application of two-eyed seeing. So I think that's important, as we're all developing our own understanding of that.
Thanks. The next one starts with saying thank you for your presentation, and they have a point and a question. As someone who has worked in DFO science, certainly don't see myself as adhering to Judeo-Christian framework of human superiority overall. So perhaps some of our way of working is already a blend of two-eyed seeing. My question is to do with a statement regarding values and benefits. That salmon and humans benefit for each other. Can you explain to me how salmon benefit from us? Were they not better off before humans arrived? Mr. Chabu.
I would say they probably were before humans arrived. But meanwhile, people see themselves in a relationship with salmon. It's part of our responsibility. They take care of us, they provide us food, they provide us opportunity for nature and ceremony, and we give back by, you know, being conservative and sustainable and taking what we need as opposed to taking many, helping taking on stewardship approaches and helping maintain habitat quality. So, you know, the relationship that we have is about respectful as opposed to just taking it because it benefits us.
Perfect.
It implies that we need to do something in exchange for the salmon, and we don't always see that in other cultures.
Thanks. I got a question from Olivia Goodbrand. How has the role of women in Mi'kmaq governance evolved? Were women included in traditional decision-making processes, and do women have a voice today at decision-making tables, like salmon, for example?
Interesting. Historically, women had their role as being the educators, the ones who passed down the family traditions and teachings. So their role was seen as being very important. A lot of decisions were made traditionally with women. Unfortunately, today our Grand Council is more of the spiritual body, and it doesn't have women represented through its Grand Council, but they are in another role that helps them make those decisions as well. In contemporary Mi'kmaq governance, I would say yes, there's a lot of education that has been acquired by both males and females. So I don't think there's a distinction between, you know, who's there. There are women chiefs, there are as decision makers, there are, you know, women lawyers and people who are in the roles that would help serve the Mi'kmaq people in terms of educating those who need to be educated for decisions. So I would say that, you know, they're there. I would like to see them a bit more prominent, but sometimes that's, you know, sometimes being the teachers and the educators and making sure those traditions are passed down are not something that is as obvious as we make it seem, you know.
Thanks. There's two more questions. The next one, at what point is IK actually considered in fishery management related decision making? And how do we adopt the two-eyed seeing approach?
I would say IK is in salmon. We are using our entire conservation harvest plan is underpinned by the values of both knowledge systems. And what was it, the other question?
The other one would be, how do we adopt the two-eyed seeing approach?
Okay. Also too, in other fisheries related management, like there's no other, well, management plans. There are some that are out there, but fishers will go out and fish using their own knowledge system. So it may not be in a licensed condition, but it's something that they're taught. So it's part of it's part of their way to fish in general. So they are fishing using IK, but they're also fishing too with the understanding that they may have learned some things from somewhere else. And how to integrate two-eyed seeing, I feel the best way to do that is through partnerships. Engaging with Indigenous peoples, creating some sort of mechanism for each to learn from each other. I think without that, it becomes difficult. And even when you do have it, it still can get difficult. But it's not something, it's not like Western knowledge where you can get it off the internet or you can, you know, look at a scientific paper and formulate a decision based on that, right? It comes from that relationship with the land, the relationship with the water and different species that are in there, and those obligations to continue to support those species. So without the processes, it's very difficult to learn, and I think that is the essence of two-eyed seeing.
Okay, you also added the DFO's point of view regarding this question. Like I guess I meant from DFO's point of view when he was asking the question, but
about
the fisheries management related decision making, and the two-eyed seeing approach.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, the table that we don't have very many consultation tables. We do have one for salmon. We do have one for eel. I'm not sure if there are other consultation tables. Those are the two that I've been involved with. And we are, you know, it does come from relationship building. It does come from those processes and that opportunity to learn from each other. So, you know, COVID kind of slowed things down, I think, for a lot of us, in that we couldn't meet, we couldn't learn. It's much, of course, easier to build relationships in person than it is through video. But I think those opportunities are necessary. And like I said, partnerships, and thinking about being a partner, you know, does require, you know, equality, and you need to have shared decision making. And I'm not sure if all government bodies are quite ready for that, but at the same time, it's, you know, when you're doing two-eyed seeing, it's about respecting what's most important and negotiating what's most important in order for things to go ahead. You don't always agree, and that's where the respect comes in. But if you manage to get and manage to recognize the values that are most important, I think that's a great way to start.
Well said. The last question here is, what is the Mi'kmaq perspective on the broader health of the stock across the range?
Mi'kmaq perspective. Well, I can't say so the Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kmaq is quite large. So it does, you know, incorporate Eastern Quebec and includes also Newfoundland. So, you know, in our area, we have seen a decline. We have seen it go up. We've seen it go down. We have very limited fishing where we are in SFA 19. And in fact, we've been providing the status for those rivers to fishers to help them make their decisions. So for the most part, we tend to fish where there's fish. So our efforts shift mostly to the Marguerite River, and that's a 2-hour drive for some of us. So it's not something that, you know, if you want salmon, you be prepared to be on the road for about 4 hours, and hopefully you'll get one. But overall, we do believe that it is declining. We do see issues in rivers, and you know, we feel very sad because, you know, it could be, you know, could be like losing who we are as people. And we've seen that happen for the Wolastoqey, and they're very, you know, I would never want to be in that position. So I think it's really, you know, a challenging spot to be in, especially when the salmon abundance varies across the regions.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that, Shelley. There's a lot of other comments coming in, just really positive comments, just thanking for the information being shared, and just very thankful for that and the positive message that you gave. For those that didn't have a chance to ask a question today, the webinar series is actually recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube page. So if you ever want to come and watch later, you can. If you think of questions after the fact, please send an email and we'll do our best to get an answer back to you. And I also like to take this opportunity to mention that we actually have 2 other webinar sessions in the month of November. The next one is November 16th with Xavier Bordelot, and his will be on post-spawning ecology of, I'm going to say this word really wrong, Heteroparasomonids, basis of variability in migratory behavior and survival, ecological importance, and conservation implications. So once again, Shelley, we just thank you for the time that you took today, and also for everybody that joined us and participated. I'm very grateful for that, and I guess we hope to see you all soon.
Well,